storyteller in our family was my mother, and I was reflecting today that Saturday will be the 7th anniversary of her death over at St. Mary's, and it wasn't their fault, but anyway, our family, we all grew up in Alaska, and you'll find out how and why, but my mom was just an inveterate storyteller, and we get in the car and drive places like on Sunday. Our one family vacation was driving down the Alaska Highway before it was paved. And my mother would play the ukulele and tell stories. And at one point I remember we said, that was a 60-miler, Mom, 60 miles. And she'd be, furious if anybody interrupted her. But this is my turn to tell a story. And this story is about my mother and about my father. And my parents met when my mother was 19 years old in Birmingham, Michigan, which is a very ritzy community in the outskirts of Detroit. And she walked into her garage with a box of chocolate cupcakes under her arm, which I think for her is quite defining, actually, in so many ways. And when she walked in, her brothers were showing a guy a boat that they were building in the garage. And this guy's name was Don Roberts. And my mother sort of threw off a couple sarcastic remarks when her brother said, hey, bring us one of those cupcakes. And she was like, is your arm broken? And at any rate, she thought this guy was kind of handsome. He had brown eyes, and she knew that, according to genetics, that if they mated, she probably had a recessive brown somewhere, and she wanted some brown-eyed kids. So immediately she was... I mean, if you're 19, you've been to 1 year of college in Europe, and it's 1952, you're ready to start looking for a mate. At any rate, this was spring of 1952, and so Dawn asked Susie, as they called her, out, and they went on, 4 dates. Nary a kiss. But she liked him. She thought he was fairly literate. He then said, have you ever been attracted to somebody because they know where to put a semicolon? Those genes. At any rate, he then went to Alaska for the summer and worked as a U.S. Fish and Wildlife agent. Of course, we had no state government then. Alaska was only a federal territory. So he was gone for the summer, and I think my mother received a couple of kind of non-committal letters from him. And then he came home at Christmas. And they went on maybe a half a dozen dates over Christmas, where my father really was the center of attention amongst these married couples. He was 7 years older than my mother. And as he talked about his sparkling travel logs related to Alaska and bears and growing beards and the midnight sun and whatnot. So he still had not kissed her. Even New Year's Eve had passed, and he was busy telling one of his Alaska stories while my mother was discussing raising Irish setters with somebody. So her plan was, I will take him back to the house on the next date, and I will put on music for lovers and turn off all the lights. And she said it worked. He did kiss her, but when their lips parted, he paused and then said, you smell like Seagram's VO. So that was my parents' history before he then went back to Alaska and wrote a few more non-committal letters. And then, I guess it would have been March. He wrote a letter and really used the words like this. I wasn't sure when I was there, but now I'm pretty sure that I'm in love with you. Life with me, I just read this letter this week. Life with me would be uncertain. This would be an understatement of epic proportions. And I would expect my wife to hunt and fish with me. Shows you how much he knew Sue Pomeroy. Because I remember once asking my parents, they both told me they wanted to be cremated, which was cool. It's a lot cheaper than burial, as I've discovered with each of them. At any rate, so my mom said she'd love to have her ashes at Hudson Bay Department Store in Detroit. That's her idea, and was her idea growing up, of a good time. She shopped for sport. Her father was vice president of General Motors for public relations, and they had a new convertible every year. They had maids during the Depression. My father's wish to have his ashes disposed of were to be deposited in a saddlebag, and that a string of horses would take them up and deposit them in the Brooks Range. For those of you who have ever been to Alaska, you know that's beyond the Arctic Circle. That's out there. As it is, he's now on Mount Wrights, and that's about as close as we could get it. My mother, in case you couldn't tell, was a terrible romantic. She had just read that book by D.H. Lawrence, Lady Chatterley's Lover, and I once said to her, how is it you fell in love with that? You guys are so different. She said, well, you know that book. I had just read it, and of course, she's making love with the game warden on the hearth. And he was a game warden. She said, I just thought he was like a pioneer hippie dude. And it was exciting. So when he wrote this letter about life would be uncertain, she took that to be a marriage proposal and said yes. And I'm not making this up. And 3 weeks later, they were married in Birmingham, Michigan, and the next morning they got in the Chevrolet Bel Air that her parents had given them, and they drove to Alaska. And they ended up, if you've ever been to Alaska, it truly is a magical and beautiful place. They ended up in the Kenai Peninsula, which is magical and beautiful, except if you're living in a 19-foot travel trailer. And my dad, of course, as a warden, was gone all the time. And my mother, at that point, was pregnant with me. In 3 years, she had 3 children. By age 27, she had 4. This was not out of character for a woman of the 50s. We know this. You went to college to get your MRS, which seems so, I didn't even know what that meant when my mother told me that. So we were all 4 of us raised in Alaska. And I tell people, quite honestly, we never had recreational soccer. We never played like youth softball or youth baseball. We hiked, we hunted, we learned how to use rifles and pistols and bows and arrows and canoes, and that was our recreation. That was our upbringing, primarily due to our father, of course. My mother was shocking mostly. She never really did go outdoors ever that I recall too much. She really did not and never did like fishing or hunting, and she didn't do that. So my mother progressed from a woman who at 19 and 1953 fell in love with this romantic idea of this virile game warden. I don't know if I was conceived on a hearth or elsewhere, but just this week, I inherited all their boxes of letters, and I was going through it, and I saw this progression of this 20-year-old woman to a woman of age 50 who was writing letters at this point that said the opposite of what she was saying 30 years prior, which was in 1953, she was saying, well, wherever we end up, it's Dawn's decision. And in 1983, as she was preparing to leave him and go to the University of Oregon for a writing program, her letters were, why does it always have to be what you decide? But they stayed married. 2 years later, I had twins, and which if you've ever had 2 babies at a time, you're kind of in a fragile, crazy period. And my mother called and said, I'm leaving your dad, and I'm moving to Tucson, Arizona, which she did do. And he continued to come down here and visit her conjugally, as far as I can tell, on a hearth and otherwise, for years. And I would come down and visit them as well. So our family continued. My parents were married then 37 years until accidentally my father came out of the closet at age 64. When my mother opened a pack of pictures, you used to have to send your pictures away to get them developed, and she opened them when they came to her house here in Tucson. And I can tell you that when you talk about homosexuality or people being gay in the theoretical sense, it's awesome. I'm progressive, I'm a liberal, it's great. When it's your dad that you thought you knew for 30-some years, I can tell you, for our family, it was an adjustment. But particularly for my mother, who said, thanks a lot, buddy. Now I'm 57, old and fat. Why couldn't you have have told me before I married you, so I could have married, I don't know, some other game warden. At any rate, so I talked to my father and I said, you owe us the opportunity to talk to you about this, and I just need to know why. Why did you marry Mom? Because she's really, really hurting. And he said, because I love her. I like her. She's my best friend. And he said, most of all, I really wanted children. So my parents, of course, were divorced. They both ended up back in Alaska, and my mother ended up having a heart attack. And my father and his partner, John, who is about my age, a wonderful man our whole family loved, took my mother in. They lived together, and they nursed her back to health. My father remarried her so that she would have Alaska state employee retirement health insurance. They moved back down here, lived separately, never lived together again. My mother, who fell in love with Bisbee, got the most darling apartment down there. I went down there with her to see it with these open brick walls and wooden floors, and it was so darling, and all her boxes were there, and she was getting ready to move in, and my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And he and John were no longer living together. They were still very friendly, and we considered John a part of our family. But my mother moved down to Green Valley, into my father's townhome, and she slept on the floor, and she stayed there in the 90 days until he died. And that's the story of my